By way of pursuing my first thesis, that each comics page is a poem, I want to introduce two comics masters, Winsor McCay and George Herriman. Both of these artists worked in the early part of the 20th century for newspapers, and both of them produced large-scale, broadside-sized comics. I think that looking at them will show how each page can stand alone in developing and pursuing an individual argument, a poetic thesis, as it were. So to begin, I'd like to introduce the comics master, Winsor McCay. McCay was born in 1867 and is best known for Little Nemo in Slumberland. McCay did a number of works before that and went on to do animation as well. But Little Nemo in Slumberland is his defining work. It was produced first for the New York Herald, and then, after falling out, he moved to William Randolph Hearst's New York American. It was produced in a large, broadsheet size, full newspaper. And I'd like to read to you a comic from December 3rd, 1905, Little Nemo. So, I'm not sure you can read this on your screen, but just enjoy it as I read it to you.
Your Majesty, may I try to bring Nemo here? I have a very brilliant idea.
You just can, and I hope you succeed.
Little Nemo was nicely snoozing when a feeling of floating in the air came over him. He felt the bed ascending ceilingward, and while it astonished him, it also interested him considerably. Nemo was rather inclined to enjoy the sensation when he was startled by a slat dropping from underneath, and from then on he was all excitement. His curiosity, however, stayed his fears. The falling of the bed slat spoiled for him what otherwise might have been a delightful trip through the sky. But the vanishing of his bed, piece by piece, kept him so busy guessing that sightseeing was out of the question. The night was clear, but windy. Nemo was really shipwrecked in the air, and while the gale whistled through the rigging, Nemo was seen desperately struggling with the ramparts of his bed. But it seemed our brave boy must soon perish until he arrived at the moon, where he was most cordially received. Although he was all but exhausted and anxious to land someplace, Nemo hesitated when he saw the vast doorway. However, he cautiously entered, after listening to the glib tongue of lunatics, the guide. Nemo could not resist the temptation to step inside, for a second at least, but was only for a second, as the great door closed up like a bear trap, and, as we observe, almost caught our tired and discouraged hero. It was almost cruel for lunatics to pursue little Nemo, but he meant no harm. "Don't run away! Wait a minute! Don't run! Don't run away! I won't hurt you! No! Never!" He wished only to bring Nemo to Slumberland, where a weeping princess awaited. But Nemo could not, would not listen. His only thought was home and how to get there. "Mama, oh Mama, come get your little Nemo, oh!" When he ran completely around the moon, some dozens of times, he became so utterly exhausted that he gave up the chase and screamed until he awoke. "I told you last night that you would dream if you ate those donuts, but you would not listen." This is a poem about the dangerous space of the imagination. In it, the reader and Nemo must navigate the grid. And as I read, I wonder if you, when following, you could see how difficult it was for me to navigate the grid. Now, it's interesting because initially we're faced with a fairly clear grid on this page. It's a regular 4x4 grid, and the opening part of the grid is divided, just like Mark Bagley divided his, into an opening title that slowed us down and set the premise, and then we were hit with 4 steady beats that showed us that this was a 4x4 grid. But then something tricky happened. each panel divided the grid into two separate large panels, and in the center we had an organizing panel. And as I read, I had to actually read around that large circle of the moon. I had to read around it and find my way, just as Nemo was finding his own way. Indeed, if you see, and you have to squint up your eyes to see this on the screen, but if you see the actual prose, the prose sections are numbered to guide me through. But even that is not helpful enough, because when I got to the final tier, I had to break reading the prose and turn my eyes to see what Lunatics and Nemo were saying. So within this grid, this basic 4x4 grid that's broken up into various sections, it's not a straight 4x4 grid, but it holds to the 4x4 principle. We see complications. We see complications in which I threaten to get lost, even as the story is telling about Nemo threatening to get lost in his dream. The name Nemo means nobody, and I think that is the essence of the threat in this comic. The threat of losing yourself in your imagination. Comics are like dreams. They're dangerous. They present the imagination in a threatening way at times. Maurice Sendak, author of Where the Wild Things Are, says this about Little Nemo. Little Nemo is a catalog of nightmares, a profusion of extreme fantasy images rendered with such explicit definition that the dream is captured in all its surrealistic exactitude. What I want to offer you here is that this is a poem about the power of dreams and the power of comics and the power of the imagination, and it is a poem offered to us over 100 years ago. Art is not progressive. Art does not need hundreds of years to pass to reach a great statement. McKay could come to this observation early on in his career and at the very beginning of comics development in the 20th century. Leaving McKay, I'd like to turn to another comics master, George Herriman. George Herriman was born in New Orleans in 1880. He moved to Los Angeles eventually, and he began writing comic strips across his life. Crazy Cat is his defining work, and Crazy Cat originated in an earlier strip that Herriman was doing in 1910 called The Dingbat Family, and in that Herriman developed the character the Cat. Then in 1913, he began doing for Hearst's New York Evening Journal the Crazy Cat strip. Initially, it ran for years in black and white, and then in 1935 it was printed in color. In it, Herriman imagines an incredible world set in Arizona, and he uses the colors in 1935 to evoke that world, that southwestern desert of America, very vividly. Overall, Crazy Cat is a poem about color, I think. It's a poem about the surrealistic landscape of New Mexico, and this page that I want to read to you is particularly a poem on color and desire. Desire permeates all the Crazy Cat comics, and in it, Herriman tells us of a love triangle, where Ignatz Mouse, who you can see in the first panel running there, is pursued by Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat is androgynous. Crazy Cat is both sometimes a man, sometimes a woman. Crazy loves Ignatz, but Officer Bull Pup loves Crazy. So together this is a triangle, and Herriman says about Crazy that Crazy is something like a sprite, an elf. They have no sex, so that cat can't be a he or a she. The cat's a sprite, a pixie, free to butt into anything. Let me read to you this page. Crazy Cat. No!
Yes.
Success! As if. Bah! Why waste time? Stovepipe, mouse, brick, everything, everybody. Over! Little blondish beautiful, so pink, so fair, like a primp rose. Where is he at now?
Blap. What? A little Ethiopian mice, black. Like a month full of midnights. Phew. Oh, yeah? Pow. Wait! Such a noive! I got a great care who I associate with, you sunburnt coffee cake. This little titch suitin' pimples to keep their own social spears fresh. Boomf! Hey, this time I'll... Ignatz! Darling!
Happy as a tree full of larks, thanks to my efforts in keeping that mouse out of his way. So, this is an interesting panel. Quite clearly, it's a 3x3 grid that's then divided into 4 at the bottom. And it's interesting because it sets out that Officer Pup is after Ignatz, and Ignatz hides in that stovepipe. The stovepipe itself moves through the panels. It is a kind of traveling motif that drops from tier to tier to tier. And in it, it's capable of turning Ignatz's color. Now, Crazy, apparently, is very sensitive to color. The police force is entirely oblivious to it, doesn't know what's going on. But what's interesting is that Harriman keys his whole story of love triangle to the notion of color. That color is fluid, that people make judgments based on it. Keep to your own social spheres, says Crazy. And that's entirely based on Ignatz changing color from black to white. So what I want to suggest is that Harriman creates a rigid grid. But within that, he's dealing entirely with the fluidity of the self. And that notion of the self, I think, is expressed in Harriman's own life. If the comic is about gender and identity, Harriman, born in New Orleans, his birth certificate tells us that he's colored. But when he dies, his death certificate records him as Caucasian. So the comic and Harriman's life, they ask a simple question. What defines anyone? What grids do we live in that define us? How do we move through those grids? What motifs tumble from tier to tier in our own lives to define us as one way or another? So my point of these 2 lectures is simply to suggest that comics can use the grid to suggest ways that our imagination is free from the grid. Comics can show us that structure permits fluidity, and also comics can show us that though we tend to think of ourselves in the present and to think of our own world as dealing with incredibly complicated issues, in fact, over 100 years ago, just under 100 years ago, we see these comic artists exploring tremendously complicated issues.